Now introduce Nicholas Chu, who's at the University of Bristol and is going to speak to us tonight about the role of gardens in helping supporting insect pollinators, particularly in an urban situation. And yes, I'll at that point just hand straight over to you, I think, Nick.
Excellent. So, yeah, thanks for the introduction. So I'm doing a PhD at the moment at the University of Bristol in Jane Memmott's community ecology group. And that PhD is focusing on insect pollinators in an urban setting. So today I want to talk about the role that gardens can play in supporting our insect pollinators. So I'll start off by just briefly discussing why pollinators are important. And I appreciate I'm preaching to the converted here, perhaps. I'll touch then on the diversity of pollinators. So most of you here will probably be aware of honeybees and their importance, but of course there's a wide variety of other pollinators that have very important roles. I'll mention pollinator decline and why we should be concerned about it. And then the main part of the talk will focus on the garden habitat, so the importance of gardens for pollinators. And then I'll finish off by just discussing what you can do to help out. So why are pollinators important? As someone who works in the field of pollination, it's nice to see that the media have got so involved and that bees and pollinators are such a hot topic at the moment. But at the same time, there's often a lot of misunderstanding in terms of the precise importance of pollinators. So pollinators are responsible for aiding in fertilization of nearly 90% of all flowering plant species. So they are critically important for underpinning terrestrial ecosystems and for providing ecosystem services to people, particularly in the form of food production. But there's a lot of misrepresentation. For example, people thinking that all pollinators are bees and all bees are honeybees, describing honeybees themselves as an endangered species in a post in the United States, where honeybees aren't even a native species over there. Anyone who's seen Bee Movie will be aware of the many inaccuracies that that film contains. And you see a lot of comments like in the center here, no bees, no food, no life. So with that in mind, I think it's important just to discuss the importance of pollinators, what they matter for and what they don't matter for. So actually, most crops that we produce globally are not pollinated by insects. The top 5 are sugarcane, maize, rice, and wheat, which are wind-pollinated grass crops. Potatoes coming in, sorry, they were the top 4. Potatoes coming in at 5 are a tuber crop, where pollinators only really matter for seed production. So overall, pollinators are actually responsible for around about 5 to 8% of the total quantity of crop production worldwide, which is still in the hundreds of billions per annum. But what they are incredibly important for is the diversity of our diets, and that has important implications for human health. So 76% of leading food crops depend to some degree on pollinators. So I highlight to some degree here because it's not a simple binary relationship. Some fruits and seeds have increased yields or increased quality under pollination, but plants can still produce viable seeds, sometimes under self-fertilization, or indeed they can produce fruits without fertilization at all. So this study from about more than 10 years ago now looked at, from reviewing the literature, if you were to take away pollinators, what percentage reduction would you get in the yield of different crops? And then they ranked some as essential if that reduction in yield was more than 90%, things like watermelon and vanilla, cocoa, which makes chocolate, of course, and kiwi fruits. Some pollinators have a great importance, raspberries, avocados, blueberries, apples in these examples, and a modest importance for others like strawberries, or even a little importance for things like tomatoes and oranges. So these examples vary hugely with different varieties. There's some that have increased self-compatibility. But the point here is that pollinators are incredibly important for the diversity of food supply, but it's not quite as simple as perhaps a lot of people think. And it's certainly not true to say that without pollinators, we have no food whatsoever. But the diversity of our food supply is incredibly important for micronutrients, so vitamin A, C, calcium, fluoride, folic acid. And that's especially important in the developing world. So in the global south, a lot of people are deficient in nutrients. And if we were to have severe declines in pollinators, then a lot of these people would suffer severe health concerns. Of course, pollinators also are very important for medicinal plants, for timber crops, biofuels, fibers, fodder crops, a whole variety of different things. Pollinators then are incredibly diverse. So a mind-boggling 350,000 species currently are estimated to be pollinators. The true number will be much, much higher than that because we haven't described the vast majority of insect diversity. More than 99% of all pollinators are insects. The non-insect pollinators fall into mainly bats and birds, but there's also examples of pollination by lemurs, by honey possums, even by lizards on some islands. But insects mainly then are the vast majority of pollinator taxa, and that's the big four groups: the moths and butterflies in the Lepidoptera, beetles, the Coleoptera, bees and wasps in the Hymenoptera, and flies in the Diptera. That are the main four groups of insect pollinators. So the important thing to say here is that bees do not by any means comprise the majority of pollinator diversity. Around about 20,000 species of pollinator are bees out of 350,000. There's a huge number of other taxa that matter. And non-bee pollinators are important for the production of a lot of crops. So this graph here is looking at 30-something different crop varieties. And on the y-axis, we've got the percentage of visits of the pollinators to those crops. Blue then is bees, and they're ranked from the most bee-dependent to the least. And you can see that honeybees in dark blue represent quite a large proportion of visits to these crops. But some, like lowland coffee or field beans here, are much higher proportion of other bees, probably solitary bees and bumblebees in this case. And actually, some crops are very highly dependent on visits by non-bee pollinators. So by beetles, by other Diptera, which are flies, by hoverflies, a whole variety of different things. The next thing to talk about then would be pollinator decline. So given their importance for the pollination of wild plants and crop plants, it is concerning to see widespread declines in pollinators, as we are seeing with biodiversity in general. And it's important to say here that declines have been occurring for a very long time. And often what we're seeing is sort of the tail end of a much larger decline. If you think about the kind of large-scale changes to land use in the UK, for example, a lot of it occurred in the kind of perhaps in the early 20th century and mid 20th century. And the kind of data we have doesn't necessarily go back that far. So the kind of data we have is particularly biased as well towards Europe and North America. These kinds of data sets don't really exist in the developing world, even though they're the places where people's reliance on pollinators is the highest. So this graph here is for the United Kingdom, and it's looking at some citizen science data on occupancy of different pollinator groups. So that's basically dividing the UK up into a bunch of little grid cells, and then using citizen science observations of hoverflies and bees to get a measure of whether or not the occupancy of these grid cells has declined or increased over time. So it's measuring the distribution of pollinator diversity, and it's showing declines in hoverflies and in bees. And the factors implicated in these declines are similar to some of the other biodiversity declines you'll see. So loss of food, particularly associated with habitat loss, spread of parasites and diseases, the use of pesticides and other agrochemicals, and then climate change, which shifts the distributions of pollinators often into habitats that are not favorable and also results in more severe weather conditions. So the figure on the right here quite nicely shows for bee declines, the ways in which different drivers of decline actually interact to potentially make the picture even worse for pollinators. So just to give an example here, if we have a pollinator in an environment that has very low level of floral resources, either limited or monotonous, i.e. a very low diversity, all the same thing, like oilseed rape, for example, having a poor diet will compromise your immune system. And that means you're therefore more likely to become infected by a parasite or pathogen, which in turn then elicits an immune response, which is energetically costly and means you need to have an increased diet or increased diversity of your diet. So you get a kind of positive feedback, which means these two factors together, the net outcome of them could be even worse than just the sort of additive effect. Similarly, there's some sort of increasing evidence that certain agrochemicals can interact with others to make their toxicity higher. So in this instance, fungicides, which may not innately be that toxic to pollinators, may actually make pesticides more toxic. And sometimes this will be things to do with whether or not it increases the uptake of the pesticide into the pollinator. So a lot of studies are done on the toxicity of pesticides with a single pesticide and a single pollinator. And the reality is where you have cocktails of many different chemicals, the results could be potentially hundreds of times more toxic than these simple kind of one-to-one unrealistic studies. But nevertheless, doing studies which link a whole variety of different factors and the way they interact is very, very hard to do. The most important factor, in my view, is the loss of food due to habitat change. And this is particularly as a response to intensive agriculture. So in the United Kingdom, around about 70% of land is used for agriculture, and traditionally quite low intensity methods, which left space for wildflowers and food plants and nest sites, have been replaced with much more intensive management. So these pictures here just show what much of the UK and European and even the world's countryside used to look like. Relatively low grazing intensity of cattle would have left very flower-rich fields. In arable environments, there would have been a lot of poppies, cornflowers, and other arable weeds mixed in with wheat and cereal crops. In our uplands, we would have seen species-rich meadows. But now what we see is green deserts devoid of flowers. And this can be quite a tricky point to sell sometimes to the public, because when we see vast swathes of green, often we think there's something quite natural about that. Certainly we would view it very differently to seeing a concrete car park, for example. But if you're a pollinator, this ryegrass pasture in Gloucestershire that's been fertilized to pieces to the point where you only have a single species dominating, that may as well be concrete. It's no different to a pollinator. Or that wheat field in Wiltshire that doesn't have a single poppy or cornflower in sight. There's nothing useful to a pollinator there. And sadly, even our national parks, in theory, spaces that have been left for nature, actually look often like glorified golf courses, like the photo in the Brecon Beacons here. It's been grazed very intensively by sheep to the point where it's very, very poor in biodiversity, and there's certainly very little food there for a pollinator. In the past, it would have been covered in forests and scrub and upland meadows, and now it's just, again, a bit of a monoculture of grassland. So this leads to the perhaps slightly unusual idea that maybe urban areas have the potential to provide a refuge for pollinators amidst the desolation caused by our beloved greenbelt. And this is an idea which won't surprise many beekeepers because, of course, they'll be aware of the amount of floral resources that honeybees are feeding from in urban areas. And there are some promising results in this area. The graph on the left shows bumblebee colonies that have been placed into environments in agricultural areas, in villages and in cities, and it's measuring the number of workers that these colonies are producing. So these are experimental colonies placed out there in colony boxes rather than natural ones found in the ground. And you can see that in the village and city environments, the colonies grow larger, they grow faster, and they survive for longer in the year. And they also produce more reproductive individuals. Similarly, there's a study in Germany on the right here, which found the species richness of bees to be higher in urban areas than in rural farmland. Similar results have been found in the UK with a higher bee richness in UK urban areas. So bees seem to do best actually out of pollinator groups in urban areas. And a major reason for this is probably that they consume floral resources as both larvae and adults. And there is an abundance of floral resources in urban areas. Whereas other taxa like your butterflies and moths, for example, hoverflies, beetles, they need different resources as larvae. That could be food plants, that could be dead wood, they might need ponds. There's a whole variety of different resources required. And it might be harder to get hold of those in urban areas. So how can greyscapes ever be better than our greenbelt? And the answer here really is residential gardens are the most important reason. So they comprise about 30% of our urban areas in the UK, And that adds up to about 450,000 hectares in England, 3.5% of the land. It might not sound like a lot, but it's actually more than the area of all semi-natural grassland. It's more than the area of all broadleaf woodland, and it's even 5 times the area of our national nature reserve. So it is a really huge resource. If you look at this map of Bristol on the right here, you can see residential gardens in yellow. And apart from the dense urban core, they really are scattered all the way throughout the city. You're never far away from residential gardens if you're a pollinator. Why are gardens actually so good? So I'm going to talk about 5 factors here, focusing a lot on the food supply, particularly the nectar supply, which is something I've worked on in my PhD. So I'm going to talk about the quantity of food, the diversity of food, the timing of food production, the spatial arrangement of gardens as habitat patches, and the provision of nest sites. So this graph is from some work I did early in my PhD, which was published last year in the Journal of Ecology. And what we did is we looked at the amount of nectar produced per square meter in 4 different cities among different urban land uses. And you can see that gardens and allotments come out as the top land uses in terms of nectar per square meter. Nectar is obviously a very important energy source for pollinators, which, being flying insects, need a huge amount of energy to power their flight muscles. Parks, urban nature reserves, road verges, cemeteries, and other green space, which is everything like playing fields and all sorts of things that weren't otherwise categorized, they come out lower, and then pavement and man-made surfaces, obviously, as you'd expect, come out down the bottom. So gardens and allotments are the top land uses per square meter. Gardens cover about 30% of cities, allotments about 1%. So when you add this all up, you find that gardens produce about 85% of all the nectar that is produced in cities. Parks and other green spaces produce quite a small quantity. They cover a fairly large area, but they don't produce very much food per square meter. Allotments don't cover enough area to be a significant source. So gardens really do underpin the nectar supply in urban areas. Second, then, of course, we have diversity of food. So diversity is very important for attracting a wide variety of pollinators and ensuring they have a balanced diet. We have thousands of different plants to choose from when we go to a garden centre, so it's unsurprising that our gardens have a very diverse supply of floral resources. This diversity is helped to maintained by something called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So this is something proposed by Connell quite a few years ago. It's quite a classical kind of example in ecology. And it basically posits that at a low level of disturbance, you have relatively low diversity. At a high level of disturbance, you also have low diversity, but at some intermediate level of disturbance, diversity is highest. And we can think about this in a garden setting. Very high disturbance might be a short-mown lawn and regularly churned up borders. But then on the other hand, if you left your garden to its own devices for a long period of time, it would ultimately just get completely grown over by bindweed, brambles, a few dominant species that would reduce its diversity and blot everything else out. But in the middle, we have this intermediate disturbance. So what gardeners are doing is they're planting a lot of species to start with, which creates a lot of diversity, but then they maintain that by constantly doing just enough to prevent those plants from outcompeting each other and resulting in a small number. And the result is that gardens have a massively higher plant species richness than natural habitats. The closest natural habitats to gardens in richness is probably things like the rainforest and the South African fynbos. If you compare, for example, the 636 species I found in 59 Bristol gardens covering less than 1 hectare with a nearby national nature reserve of only 130 species in more than 100 hectares, you can see that it is just a massively enhanced species richness because of the actions of gardens. And this comes down to turnover. So beta diversity or turnover is the idea that when you go from one site to the next, the composition of species differs each time. So overall, you get a much higher richness or diversity of species than you would have if they shared a lot of species between sites. And you can imagine that in a calcareous grassland, for example, if you threw a quadrat on the floor, you'd find a lot of different species, maybe 20, 30 species. But if you threw a quadrat on the floor in another part of that grassland, a very high proportion of the species you found the first time would be there again. And by the time you throw in a quadrat 5 or 10 times, you're struggling to pick up any new species. In contrast, in 59 Bristol gardens, I found a third of species were only found in a single garden. So if I'd increased that sample to 100 or 200 gardens, if I had more time, the number of species I found would have kept on going up and ultimately leveled off at a much, much higher value. Because, of course, gardeners have a lot of plants to choose from, and they have individual differences in what they're aiming to do with their garden, which plants they want to choose, and all that kind of thing. Thirdly, then, we have the timing of food production. So the graph at the top here is a study done by Tom Timberlake in our group on the nectar supply of farmland near Bristol. And you can see that there's a very, very strong spring boom in nectar supply brought about particularly by hawthorn. Before that, there's very, very few resources in March. There's a little gap in June, then an increase in the summer, decrease again, and then a little bit more in the late summer. So it's a very boom and bust type environment where the amount of nectar might vary over a factor of 10 or more throughout the year. And of course, this matters because if you're a bumblebee, for example, which lives all the way from March through to late in the year, September, October, you need to make sure you have enough food all year round. Likewise, to support a diverse community of pollinators, like the ivy bee, for example, which only emerges in August, September, you need to make sure that there is food at any time that it's needed. But in gardens, the picture is very different. You have a relatively stable, continuous supply through the year. So the bottom graph is the aggregate of the nectar supply in my 59 urban gardens. And it varies by a factor of 2 across the year, on average between months. So there is a summer peak, but actually there's still plenty of food at all times of year from March through to the end of October. And this comes down to something called the portfolio effect. So individual gardens vary enormously. There was an example of a garden that had its peak nectar in every single different month from March to October, just depending on whether they happen to have a flowering currant versus an ivy or a salvia or what have you. So you get huge variation among single gardens, but very quickly that variation smooths out when you add across many, because of course you'll get complementarity between the March peak and the October peak and the July peak. So you get quite a smooth, stable resource overall as a result of many, many individual gardens being managed quite independently. Which has an analogy to investing in a variety of stocks and shares. And of course, in gardens, we have so many species to choose from. You can imagine some of these gaps we see in farmland being plugged. So, for example, March, flowering currants, cherry laurel hedges, Pyrrhus, for example, are all flowering, and they are reducing that kind of March gap. In June, it might be something like honeysuckle or a wide variety of herbaceous plants, salvias in August, and ivy perhaps in October, or mahonia. And this continuous supply of resources through the year in urban areas has even led to changes in the kind of behaviour and the life cycle of some of the pollinators. So we're seeing increased winter activity amongst bumblebees. Here are some photos I took of, on the top, bumblebees out very early, queen bumblebees emerging in February, and at the bottom, some worker bumblebees in December. So in this case, they've got novel resources that are not very common in the wider countryside: hellebores, crocus, fragrant honeysuckle, and mahonia. So in this case, actually, a lot of bumblebee colonies will not die back in the autumn as they traditionally would have done, because perhaps climate change, perhaps increased temperatures in cities, but also continuous supply of floral resources, meaning they don't have to die back, particularly things like mahonia, which is very important. So they actually produce another brood, and you'll often see worker bumblebees foraging in gardens right through the winter. The next factor that I want to talk about is the spatial arrangement of habitat patches that gardens provide. So on the right here, we've got some satellite images of an arable farmland and a city, and they're taken exactly the same scale. And you can see that these two landscapes are very, very different in their degree of fragmentation. The farmland is comprised of some very, very big fields that are all be completely the same within them, some hedges and some small patches of semi-natural habitat. In urban areas, you have a much more finely resolved level of fragmentation. So you have many, many incredibly small gardens, along with parks, buildings, roads, etc. And this has some quite important implications for the foraging of pollinators. So if you imagine the yellow hives here are where the nest of the pollinator is, let's imagine it's a bumblebee foraging from a hedgerow nest in the farmland. It has to travel quite far between habitat patches to find food. When it gets there, it might have a lot of food available in quite a big patch. But of course, there's a limit to how much nectar or pollen a bee can actually transport back. So if it burns through a lot of nectar on the way, it's a very inefficient way of foraging. But in an urban area, there's much more resources available in small patches nearby. So you're more likely to be close to some food. And actually, there's a recent paper from Royal Holloway Research Group doing some work in London, which looked at decoding the waggle dance of honeybees, and from that estimating how far away they're foraging. And it found that they were foraging about 50% further away from their nest on average in farmed landscapes, adding evidence to this idea that there's more food close to you in an urban environment, which makes foraging much more efficient. Then there's nest sites. So gardens have a variety of novel nest sites used by bees, and these can include things like compost heaps, bird boxes, which are often used by the tree bumblebee, which was a relatively recent arrival in the UK. Then you've got walls and bee hotels used by mason bees, a whole variety of different novel nest sites that bees seem to be using. So gardens appear to be very, very well used by bees for nesting. So what are the disadvantages? What are the main drawbacks for garden habitats? So one potential is non-natives. Most plants in a garden are not native. It's typically around 70% of species. And from my data of something around 90% of all the nectar comes from non-native sources. But are non-natives still attractive and nutritious to our native pollinators? Well, this image is from the Bumblebee Conservation Trust website on creating a wild bumblebee garden. And we can see a native pollinator, Bombus terrestris, interacting here, feeding from a non-native species of plant, a globe thistle, Echinops retro. Should this surprise us in some way? And the answer is not at all when you actually look closely at their distributions. So naturally, Bombus terrestris is found all across Europe into the Near East and North Africa. Echinops retro is found pretty much throughout continental Europe, just doesn't happen to be found in the UK. So if you saw a Bombus terrestris interacting with an Echinops retro in Italy, for example, you wouldn't be at all surprised because they overlap in their native range. So actually, given the glacial history of Europe and the fact that the assemblage of plants and animals we have in the UK is a result of a number of chance processes, things have come and gone throughout glacial and interglacial periods. To me, it doesn't make any sense to draw a distinction between a plant found in continental Europe and a plant found in the UK, in terms of thinking they might have some fundamentally different traits that make them different for pollinators. And actually, we don't have any endemic pollinators in the UK, so all our pollinating species are present in other parts of the UK, so they will often actually interact with a variety of what we might refer to as non-native plants in their native range. The picture is a little bit different when you start to think about exotic plants from further afield. So this fuchsia, for example, from South America. But here we can see a Bombus terrestris robbing it through the top for nectar. And actually, there's almost no plants that I haven't seen a pollinator consuming nectar from somewhere in a garden. Nectar in particular is quite a generalized resource. It's not particularly specialized. It's largely a sugar solution. So if you can access it, then I think pollinators will use it wherever they are. But certainly the inherent biological differences between non-natives and natives, there's a more meaningful argument when you're talking about species that are from further afield, particularly species that have evolved for bird pollination, for example, that might have different nutritional compounds within them than ones that have evolved for bee pollination just in another country. So I like to think of urban areas as a bit of an all-you-can-eat buffet. There are a whole bewildering variety of different food sources out there, and there are ones that are going to be good, and there's ones that are going to be bad, if you know how to choose between them. Some pollinators are going to really take advantage of this and consume a whole load of different foods, like Bombus terrestris, the buff-tailed bumblebee, for example. Others might just feed on a few, and there might be a small minority that can't eat anything at all. So undoubtedly, the resulting pollinator community that we see in an urban environment would be different to what we would see in a calcareous grassland or a farmland or a heathland. And there may be a slight bias towards generalists that can eat pretty much anything. But actually, there's a lot of specialists that might be able to find new resources through the bewildering diversity of plants. So a couple of examples quickly. We have a specialist campanula bee in the UK that will only take pollen from campanula plants. And in urban areas, there's a lot of non-native campanulas that people grow in their gardens. This is bellflower. And so through the the increased campanulas in urban areas from non-natives, we've actually seen an increase in the diet breadth of this specialized bee. Similarly, there's a species of bee called the loosestrife oil bee that takes floral oils from a native species of loosestrife. And again, in gardens, there's a species, the spotted loosestrife, that's come in that this bee is now starting to use. So exactly what effects non-native plants will have on generalist and specialist pollinators is still a bit unknown, but I certainly think there's scope for some specialists to do well even with non-native species, even though others perhaps will not. The next possible disadvantage in gardens is what my supervisor likes to call horticultural bling. So that's your highly modified, fluffy, multi-petal type plants that are either completely devoid of floral resources at all. So multi-petal ones like this camellia or roses or dahlias often have had their nectaries and their reproductive plants producing pollen actually bred into extra petals. So they really do produce no food at all. Or in others, like this fluffy carnation, there is actually bucket loads of nectar down there because I've measured it. But pollinators can't possibly get through to it because it's just hard to access. So there's a lot of duds out there, if you like, plants that pollinators can't do a lot with. But there are so many good species and so many different plants in urban areas that I don't think a few duds are going to ruin it for everyone else. And ultimately, the amount of nectar from accessible sources is still very high. And actually, often the biggest sources of food are not even ornamental plants. So when you go around gardens and you measure the nectar, you actually find that plants like Pyrrhus, which is usually grown more for its foliage than its small flowers, Japanese maples, privet hedges, laurel hedges, a whole load of not traditional ornamental flowers are actually providing bucket loads of the food. Then another factor is pesticides. This is always quite a contentious topic. The extent to which pesticides are what are driving declines in pollinators and limitations in their populations versus the extent to which food is driving it and pesticides are just pushing them over the edge into declines, it's quite hard to know. But there is a lot of pesticide use in urban areas and in gardens. So this study was looking at Wyville Garden Centre to look at plants that had already been treated with pesticides. And it found that ornamental plants are widely treated with a mixture of insecticides and fungicides, that significant residues of these chemicals are still present when they reach retailers and gardeners. And they said the safest option would be to buy plants from an organic nursery or grow plants from seeds or plant swap. So to finish off then, what can you do to increase the value of your garden to pollinating insects? Because there's huge variation between gardens. So in my 59 gardens I surveyed in Bristol, I found anywhere between 2 grams of nectar sugar produced across the year, all the way up to 1.7 kilograms. So that's about a 700 times difference between the worst garden and the best. And there was no correlation actually with the size of the garden. There was so much variation with nectar-rich small gardens and nectar-poor big gardens skewing any trends, but I didn't find the bigger gardens producing more food. So that actually gives everyone an opportunity, however much space you have, to help pollinating insects. So number one, maximize flowers per unit space. This is pretty basic advice, but the more plants that are present, the more flowers, the more food. And shrubs are a really good way of getting a lot of flowers into a small kind of two-dimensional space. So this ceanothus bush in Bristol in sunny weather was absolutely crawling with honeybees, bumblebees, rose chafers, syrphids, whole variety of different insects. Secondly, planting for year-round colour. So making sure there's food early in your garden, in the mid-season and late as well. Some good early sources here include willows, crocus and pyrrhus, and late sources, things like sedums, ivy and mahonia. For late sources, it's important to prioritize the more open flowers. I actually found that about 80% of all the nectar was being produced by tubular flowers, so things like fuchsia and salvia and honeysuckles. The nectar resources in these flowers can only be reached by quite long-tongued bees, so bumblebees, honeybees perhaps, some of the Lepidoptera, so the moths and butterflies. But the shorter-tongued insects like hoverflies, solitary bees, and other flies wouldn't be able to consume these resources. So even if there's bucket loads of nectar down a salvia or down a fuchsia, it's completely useless to a lot of our pollinators. So for that reason, accessible flowers like sedums and ivies and mahonias, but also things like echinacea or dahlias, if they're not multi-petal, are a very, very important late resource. The next factor then is mowing. So the less you mow the lawn, all else being equal, the more flowers you tend to get. And mowing less doesn't necessarily mean having a big wildflower meadow that has no use as a kind of lawn for you in your garden, but mowing just that little bit less can actually make quite a big difference. So this was a front garden I saw during some fieldwork in Weston-super-Mare, and it really wasn't very long at all. But probably some combination of mowing frequency and the right soil type under there meant it was absolutely covered in birds-foot trefoil, red clovers, daisies, and consequently a lot of different bees were present. Avoiding pesticides then is something we've talked about already. So either avoiding them altogether or at the very least cutting down if you feel you really need to use them is very important. This image here on the right is, I can't work out if it's sad or amusing, but it's by a bug killer, which at the same time is being advertised to have free seeds for bees. So some people aren't necessarily fully understanding the right message here. So if you do get an infestation of aphids or what have you on your plants, actually sometimes leaving it to its own devices can actually result in working itself out. So for example, there's a lot of natural enemies of different pests out there. So things like parasitoid wasps that will come in and help to remove those insects for you if you give them a chance. So definitely moving more towards the kind of model that France has, where glyphosate and lots of different pesticides are actually banned for public use in gardens, but also by town councils, I think is definitely where we should be heading. And then finally, maximizing the habitat diversity in your garden, because I've spoken most today about floral resources, particularly nectar, but flowers, of course, also produce pollen. But actually, a lot of pollinators need other resources. So larval food plants, if you're a Lepidoptera, or rotting wood for a lot of beetle larvae. Syrphids, so hoverflies larvae might consume food plants or aphids, or often they live in ponds. There's a whole variety of different resources pollinators need. And for a lot of species, the limiting factor in urban areas may well not be the food. So increasing the amount of food in your garden may not invite more butterflies in if they don't have the right food plants nearby. That's one of the reasons why bees seem to do so well in urban areas, because food in the form of flowering resources is the only thing they consume. So this kind of habitat diversity in gardens is really important. This garden here was one that did it quite well, but was by no means perfect. So it's got a flower-rich border, it's got a native wildflower meadow, shrubs, trees, fruit trees, some bare soil that perhaps solitary bees could nest in, or mason bees could use to seal their nests up. But we could also add compost heaps or hedges or log piles, a whole variety of resources. So thinking about all the different species that your garden could support, and also the different life stages, so whether the larvae need something different to an adult, like in butterflies. And certainly making your gardens a little bit less neat and tidy. Neat and tidy gardens can provide a lot of food in terms of flower borders to pollinators. But if there's a few more weeds here and there, a bit more dead wood lying around, or compost heap, that can be incredibly important for other pollinators and other life stages as well. So with that, I just want to wrap up, and I want to thank my supervisors, Jane and Kath, my main two supervisors, but also Ian and Steph based at the RHS. My field assistant, Joe, who helped me with an amazing amount of nectar quantification. We measured the nectar supplies in more than 200 different flowers species, which required something like 4,000 different flower measurements over a field season. So that was an incredibly important piece of work for the rest of my PhD. Bristol homeowners who let me traipse around their gardens, the Botanic Gardens for some support with the nectar work. And my funding was through the Natural Environment Research Council and the Royal Horticultural Society. And thanks for you all for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Nick. That was very, very good. I've got a question from Peter Tompkins, and maybe other people listening would like to pose questions as well. Please use the chat or raise a hand. Peter, would you like to unmute and ask your own question?
Of course. I wondered whether you had anything to say about plants and insects which are synergistic. I was told in South Africa, in the fynbos, there are certainly certain plants which depend on particular insects which have to live in the same vicinity. And I wondered if there were any important such synergistic properties that we ought to be aware of here in the UK. And if I could just add one not really a question, but just an observation for you. It'd be great, wouldn't it, if there was some kind of a scale or measurement that plants could have a label that gave us information as to how much pollination they deliver per square meter of growth or something. Anyway, just to ask about synergy.
Yeah, well, on your second point, actually, so the Royal Horticultural Society are part funding my PhD, and I've just started a position with them in January, which is for up to a year, and part of that position is to try and incorporate some of my findings into their sort of plants for pollinators type advice to try and make it a little bit more quantitative. So I can't give you any specific details because I don't know what they're going to be, but some kind of more quantitative or semi-quantitative measure of how good different plants are for pollinators for gardeners to use is definitely something we're looking at. Yeah, on your first point. So historically, people used to think of plant-pollinator interactions as very, very specialized. There's some famous examples like a species of moth in Madagascar that visits a particular orchid that has exactly the same length of nectar spur as its proboscis that Darwin found. But actually, more and more people have realized that pollination systems are mostly quite generalized. So pollinators visit at least a few plants, and plants are visited by at least a few pollinators. There are certainly some very specialized interactions. Certainly one I know about in South Africa, in the fame bus that you mentioned, there's a genus of bees that only visits this particular group of plants, the nemesia plants for floral oils. Sorry, Diascia, not nemesia, very closely related. In the UK, off the top of my head, I'm thinking about the same degree of specialization. There's certainly things like the loosestrife bee that will only visit loosestrife for floral oils. So there are some quite tight-knit interactions, campanula bees as well. But usually we're talking about a genus or a family of plants that are visited by that pollinator because the pollen has the same kind of nutritional composition. We don't have many examples, as far as I'm aware, of incredibly tight-knit kind of one-to-one species mappings, unless anyone else can think of any off the top of their head.
Lovely. Thanks, Nick. Ian Campbell, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi there. I was just wondering, you've given us an overview of urban gardens and how they contribute. Are there any sort of simple measures what would be the simplest measures that would make the biggest difference to providing more forage for pollinators? In terms of
things we can do?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, interestingly, I found, so things like mowing your lawn less certainly increases the amount of floral resources. But interestingly, I found in terms of quantity of nectar, it's often shrubs and trees seem to be the biggest thing. You'd have gardens where it's actually one of the gardens I used on the front of my PowerPoint. It's medium-sized garden, big lawn, lots of borders, hanging baskets. But there were 2 shrubs in it that produced something like 90% of the nectar whenever they were flowering. I can't remember exactly what it was. Maybe it was a choisia and a ceanothus, something like that. So in terms of the raw quantity of nectar, shrubs, because of the way they can have thousands of flowers in a very small part of your garden, and an equivalent amount of border you'd require a huge space to get the same number of flowers. Shrubs seem to be like the biggest simple thing you can do if you pick a nectar-rich one, like a pyrrhus or something like that. That would be my biggest piece of advice: shrubs and trees.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, so we'll all get planting. I was struck early on by your picture of the Brecon beacons, and Roger Patterson also has a question on the same thing. So Roger, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, Nick, this is prompted because I live fairly close to the South Downs, and I spend quite a lot of time walking the dogs up there, and of course you get a lot of miniaturization of plants up there. So that was why I asked a question. It's based on your picture of Brecon beacons. If you don't mind, I'll read the question. Early on, you showed a photo of the Brecon beacons. There may have been a high concentration of flowers, but subject to miniaturization. Presumably, the smaller flowers produce less nectar and pollen, but I've no evidence of that, and I don't know. I'm just assuming that. If so, is the extra number of plants that you tend to get in these areas that are close grazed, high concentration, likely to compensate? I mean the same amount of nectar and pollen, but in more smaller flowers.
Okay, so As far as I'm aware, under grazing pressure, you get, I believe, I wasn't aware you got flowers that were smaller. I thought you got plants that flowered at a lower height. So I wouldn't expect the flowers to necessarily producing a different amount of resources. Because certainly, if you graze plants, they are capable sometimes of flowering at a lower height than they otherwise would if they're naturally grazed species. But a lot of this comes down to the intensity of the grazing. And I know that, I grew up reasonably close to the South Downs, and I know that a lot of it is managed in a way that promotes flowering if it's not grazed too heavily. But I think a lot of the Brecon Beacons is simply grazed to the point where you just cannot get things flowering because it is so closely grazed to the ground. So I haven't sort of specifically done a study there, but I've certainly read a lot about it. And I think it's, for me, what's so strange is if you think about the national parks we have in America, for example, they're basically wilderness areas of forest, Yosemite, and Yellowstone that are being left to nature. But the things we call national parks in the UK are actually often farmland that just happens to be in hilly or mountainous type environments. So it's a slightly strange use of the term, and it makes it quite problematic when you start thinking about things like, the government's promise to protect 30% of land for nature, and you realise the vast majority of that is actually quite heavily grazed national parks that don't produce a lot of food for pollinators or other wildlife. So there's a huge amount of scatter, of course. I'm not saying all of the Brecon Beacons is bad or all of the Peak District or anything like that, but on average, a lot of these environments are really no better for wildlife than any other part of the country. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
Yeah.
But on the miniaturization, it was my impression that the flower size is relatively invariant between plants. Just that the plant size varies a lot. So a closely grazed plant could, if it's given the opportunity, potentially flower very low down to the ground, but those flowers themselves would be structurally very similar to if it was higher up.
Could I just add a question to that one on the national parks? Do government recognise that this is the situation, and do you think anything's likely to get done about it?
I don't know. I mean, if you're interested in reading more about it, there's a very good book called Rebirding by Benedict MacDonald, and there's quite a few sort of rewilding type books out there which talk quite a lot about the sort of the status quo not being good enough, more or less. I think for the government, it's relatively similar to tree planting. It's relatively easy to give simple measures like we've planted this number of trees, and most of the public don't tend to look into what that really means. But if it's, for example, Sitka spruce is being planted on peat bogs, then actually that's carbon negative. So a lot of the tree planting that happens might actually release more carbon than it captures. But these simple measures like we've done this or we've protected this much land is what most people seem to be aware of. So as far as I'm aware, a lot of ecologists know that our national parks need improving, but I don't know whether or not that's, I mean, obviously there's new announcements with rewilding and what have you recently from the government, but I think it's quite easy sometimes for them to say we've met these targets, with the targets themselves being a bit too simplistic.
Yes. Okay. Richard Glassborough has a question.
Yeah, hi, Nick. I'm interested in the bees around me in London, and particularly the number of them that are active throughout the year, particularly in the winter. And it's quite easy to see that a lot of garden plants, it's a lot coming from gardens, a lot of garden plants produce pollen year round. That's never a problem. But I don't know what's going on with the nectar production, particularly as you get down to quite low temperatures.
Yeah, so I've measured nectar in all sorts of weather. I actually started my nectar extraction field work, or tried to, during the Beast from the East week a few years back, if anyone remembers that, where it was about -3 or 4, and I couldn't get anything out of the flowers then. So I had to postpone it a week. But I've measured nectar actually in Mahonia at very low temperatures, like probably 5 or 6 degrees, and there is plenty there. So I think at very low temperatures, particularly when things start freezing, although of course nectar is going to have a much lower freezing point than water, things will get a bit weird and wacky. But a lot of these plants quite kind of naturally are pollinated at low temperatures. Bumblebees in the Himalayas, for example, or the Arctic bumblebee will quite happily fly in very low temperatures because it can warm itself up by vibrating its flight muscles. So it makes sense to me that these plants have evolved to be able to produce nectar at these temperatures. So I couldn't say it'd be the same for every species, but certainly the ones that are kind of used to flowering at those temperatures, I think there should be no issue with nectar production until perhaps you get to negative numbers or what have you.
So if they're flowering at the low temperatures, they're likely to producing nectar until you get down to really low temperatures.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done like I haven't actually done a study across the kind of the lowest temperatures, but I've certainly detected lots of nectar at pretty low temperatures. So I would imagine that's the temperatures at which bumblebees are flying, which, usually exceeding 5 degrees, but sometimes even less than that. I think there would be no issue with nectar production. It may be a bit lower than it would normally be, but there would still be plenty there. And Mahonia, for example, has absolutely bucket loads. So it's not, when you see the number of Mahonia flowers right now in winter and the number of bumblebees you see visiting them, there's certainly no limitation in terms of floral resources there as far as I can see.
And Daphne seems to be another one.
Which Lonicera as well. Daphne.
And interestingly, what I do notice is quite often with these big shrubs, you get half in sun and half out of sun, and the bees are all in the sun. So they seem to, they must work on very, very local temperature differences. Yeah,
and I know bumblebees are capable of warming their body. I mean, they're effectively warm-blooded in some respects because they vibrate their flight muscles to the point where they really can increase their body temperature a lot more than ambient. But there is a limit, and of course, using sun is it's helpful.
Can I extend that question to the other end of the temperature scale? I mean, we had a really, really hot summer last year, and it seemed to me there was very little nectar about.
Yeah, so I mean, there is also in kind of drought conditions. I don't think temperature is the most important factor, but in drought conditions, you do get reductions in nectar production. But to some extent, urban areas are buffered against that a little bit because, firstly, you've got a lot of non-natives that come from environments where they can deal with warmer temperatures, so perhaps it won't be as unusual to them. But also, people water their gardens and parks and things, so I think you're not going to get the same level of drought. I was measuring nectar back in 2018, which started off with the beast from the East week, I think. But then we had, I think, the driest summer on record or something. There really wasn't much water, but I didn't have any problem finding nectar in plants. Didn't seem to vary that much.
Thanks.
We get one of the biggest crops in London is from lime trees, and they're really fussy about the humidity conditions in the early spring and at the time of flowering, and sometimes it just doesn't happen. They flower, but there's no nectar.
Okay. I think the key to urban areas is probably there are so many different species out there that there'll be all sorts of weird and wacky things happening, but kind of averaged across many, many thousands of species, there's still a reliable resource there, even if some are being more fussy than others.
Thank you, Richard. Rinka, you have a question?
Yeah, well, Nick, thanks very much. It was absolutely fascinating. I enjoyed that.
Thanks.
And I'd like to ask you about nectar. Obviously, you mentioned that there's enormous variety in production, nectar quantity. Can you tell a bit more about the quality? So we know that flowers vary in sugar concentration, but also in composition. Simple sugars like fructose and glucose or disaccharides. Should we take that into account if you want to plant for pollinators at a wider scale? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I'll be honest, it's definitely not my expert area, the exact composition of nectar, but I know that basically the sugars in nectar are almost all sucrose, fructose, and glucose. Fructose and glucose being the two that make up sucrose. So there's an enzyme that controls the relative proportions of them depending on how much is broken down. And I know that there are differences in the preferences among pollinators for different ratios of fructose and glucose. I think that whether that's a situation where it's in an ideal world, we have this, but we'll take what we can get, I'm not entirely sure. I don't think it's an absolute requirement, but there are certainly some preferences in lab studies. Then at the same time, there's a whole load of other chemicals in nectar. So I'm sure some of you are aware of toxic nectar and all sorts of weird and wacky metabolites and toxins comprising nectar. But nutritionally, we're just talking about 3 sugars that actually don't really differ very much in their calorie content. They're pretty much identical for the overall concept. One thing that really does vary as well is the percentage sugar concentration of plants. So partly under environmental conditions, but also among species. So a lot of the bird pollinated taxa you find, or traditionally more bird pollinated taxa like fuchsia, crocosmia, for example, things like that in urban areas produce 20–30% nectar sugar. Some of the bee pollinated facts are more like 50–60% sugar. So there will be preferences and differences in what pollinators prefer. But at the same time, I see plenty of pollinators visiting fuchsias and things, even though it's a very low percentage sugar. So it probably comes down to what's available, and they'll take what they can get. But I think in my study, I've kept everything quite coarse scale. So I've always just measured total sugars, because you can do it very easily with a refractometer that you just hold up to the light. And that means I could do like 220 species to get measurements for, but work on like the composition of nectar and even pollen, which is another thing I haven't been able to include. That is really important. And I know a lot of people doing that kind of work, but for me, I had to go like broad and coarse rather than kind of narrow and focus.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Helen Tukowski.
Hi, I'm Helen's friend. I don't keep bees, but I often have something on the top of my garage in the summer. But I'm a wildlife gardener, and I'm interested in what you think, Nicholas, about the idea that the government is, at the moment, through the Environment Act, the government has said they will try to halt the degradation of natural habitats. But thinking particularly of places like the Brecon Beacons and also Dartmoor, where I live, although there's quite a lot of gorse, but there's also an awful lot of grazing. Whether we need something that like the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, which actually commits the government to restoring nature as well as halting the decline, because it's so brilliant that we're all trying to do things ourselves, but it's also kind of quite a big task for all of us. Given, the decline in nature, loss of species, we're one of the worst countries. We are the worst country in Europe for loss of species. I wonder what your view on that is.
Yeah, I mean, gardens are never going to solve the problem. There's certainly environments, there's some farmed environments where gardens might actually be the lifeline that provides pollinators with food at the right time of the year. But ultimately, when 70% of the country is covered in farmland and much of that's very intensively managed, yeah, gardens are not going to solve biodiversity decline, but they can help in some small way. Yeah, it's a tricky one, because we clearly have to balance. Yeah, we clearly have to balance the need for kind of food production in modern agriculture with making space for nature. And I think there's certainly some benefits to coming out of the Common Agricultural Policy in the EU in terms of having a bit more freedom to design our own subsidy systems. And the government recently announced, obviously, the kind of rewilding and restoration-based things that we'll have to see how that all pans out. So a lot of it is kind of, there's some interesting ideas written down on paper, and we'll have to see how things go in the next few years. But I think certainly prioritizing changing the subsidy system. So if you are farming on land that is inherently not very productive, that should be shifted and taken over for carbon storage or biodiversity conservation, and giving you subsidies for that, rather than having a system that allows you to still be able to making money on relatively unproductive land. So obviously, like an extreme example, of course, is the net rewilding approach. There's a good book on that, where basically they found that they still, even under subsidies, weren't making any money on lands that was very unproductive. And now it's one of the sort of best examples of conservation in the UK. So there's clearly a lot that needs to change. And I think we're at a stage where there seems to be a lot is up in the air, with a lot of the Environment Bill and obviously the new kind of rewilding things being announced. But obviously writing things down on paper is not, it doesn't necessarily achieve anything. So yeah, I don't really know. I'll sort of watch this space as to where we're going to be in a few years' time. And maybe I'll, in some small way, try and get involved in helping.
Thank you.
Thank you. Robert Pickard. Robert, would you like to put your question?
You're on mute.
Yes, sorry, Nicholas. I'm a bit slow on muting it. Really enjoyed your talk. One of the things that's often overlooked in gardens is, of course, the supply of honeydew, which contributes amino acids to the diet of not just our bees, but lots of other creatures. Have you got any information on the contribution that honeydew makes?
I mean, the short answer is no, but I can definitely see that it could be an incredibly important resource. I mean, I was doing some different fieldwork this year where I was actually catching bumblebees, Bombus terrestris, and the number that I caught feeding either on honeydew from aphids in cherry trees or extra floral nectaries on laurel trees. I hadn't really appreciated quite how big a resource actually honeydew or extra floral nectar from plants might be, given that my work was all quantifying floral nectar and thinking that was everything. Yeah. So I think it's an area that I only relatively recently I started to appreciate. And the short answer is, yeah, I don't actually have any data other than to say that obviously, yeah, the amount of sugar in the phloem tubes of plants exceeds the amount produced in flowers by so much that if there is a significant amount of aphid activity or what have you, it could be a major factor. Obviously, where that leads us potentially to recommending gardeners increase the number of aphids on their plants or what have you, I don't know whether that might be a hard sell, but but I think it must be a relatively underexplored area.
I think so. 20% of some phloem exudates in this liquid can be amino acids, and it's really quite a rare source nutritionally, certainly for honeybees and probably for lots of other insects.
Yeah, well, I know that some floral nectars have kind of trace amounts of amino acids that I think can be of nutritional benefit, but obviously for a lot of, well, for bees particularly, they tend to get that through pollen rather than in terms of protein through pollen rather than nectar. But yeah, no, it's not something I know a lot about, but well, I don't know if it's something anyone knows a huge amount about, but it's definitely an interesting area.
Thank you. We're sort of running over, but I've got a couple more questions. Perhaps we can just take one from Janet and then again from Ian and then Roger. So Janet, would you like to pose your question?
Yes, thank you for a very interesting talk. How do you actually measure the nectar?
So using glass microcapillaries. So these are tiny, tiny little tubes that actually you basically dip into flowers and the nectar just gets drawn up by capillary action. That makes it sound very simple. The reality, of course, is some flowers are an absolute nightmare and some are quite easy. So a nice big salvia or a foxglove or something, you go to the back, there's an obvious nectar tube. You pop a capillary tube in of the right volume and it fills up with nectar, and maybe you pop another one or two in. From there, you basically measure the length of nectar up the tube, and then that tells you the volume of nectar. And then you just pop it onto a refractometer, which is like basically passes light through well, it's got no electricity or anything, it's just using ambient light, but it passes light through the sugar solution, and the amount it refracts is put onto a percentage scale showing you the percentage sugar concentration. So you pop that up to your eye and, 43% sugar and 2 microliters, and then you get a number. Some plants are a nightmare because the nectar is more like a sticky residue rather than a kind of liquid you can draw up. So there you end up pipetting some distilled water onto the plant, dissolving that residue and then trying to extract it back. So you can't get the concentration measure, but you can hopefully get a kind of total quantity of sugar measure. But it's fiddly work. And I did that for about 220 species, trying to replicate 10 or 20 flowers per species. But it was a lot of fun. I never looked that closely at flowers in my life.
It's a phenomenal amount of work, isn't it? It's all this business about research being 99% perspiration and 1%
oh, yeah, definitely.
Right, Ian Campbell.
Hello there. I was just wondering, we've talked about quantity and quality of nectar. Some people like bug life and things like that and other studies have looked at kind of the connectivity of forage patches and have stressed the importance of that, so that bumblebees only have X range. And you mentioned that to an extent with kind of rural sites where industrialized farming might actually separate those out. I just wondered if you had a view on how important a part of that it is.
Yeah, so clearly it's particularly for some of the pollinators that can't travel as far, it is very important. So some of the solitary bees and stuff might only regularly go 100, 200 meters maybe away from their nest. So in some farmed environments, that might be impossible if you have fields that are hundreds of meters across with verges, just on the edges. It's something where sometimes you hear of urban environments being described as fragmented, but they're fragmented at such a smaller, finer scale than farmed environments that I think actually the patches are generally so much closer together. So I tend to think of unless there's major barriers to kind of navigation or dispersal for pollinators in urban areas like roads and buildings and things like that, then actually they're in a much better position because they've got so many patches so close to them. When you start to draw radii onto satellite images and you count an amount of gardens, it's quite astonishing. A bumblebee could easily visit, 5,000 gardens or something in a 500-meter radius, or some of the numbers are just incredible. So actually, I think it's something where urban areas are much better than farmed areas, but it depends exactly on your foraging range, because obviously, the amount of land you can reach from your foraging range scales up in a squared relationship. So it's a very different picture if you're a honeybee or a bumblebee to if you're solitary bees or some insects like flies, where we don't really know that much about how far they go because they're not central place foragers. But it's definitely a really important factor.
Thank you very much.
Right. Well, I think on that point, we'll leave it. Thank you very much indeed. So thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. There has been a recording of this sent to YouTube, and once we've tidied it up a little bit, that will be available to read again. So thank you to all. Thank you to those who posed questions this evening, and most of all, of course, thank you to you, Nicholas.
Well done.
Brilliant.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Many thanks.